Good afternoon. I want to thank everyone for coming to today's session. This is the second
Hey,
of 4
Mama.
sessions, and hope everybody can hear me. We are really pleased to have you here for the next session as we continue to learn concepts and approaches to
We got some
psychological
fluff.
first aid. And I wanted to hand the session over to Erin Hambrick, who will start us out today.
Hi, everyone. It's great to have you all back. Part 2, it's always good to see the interest continue. So just to give you a sense, we're going to have a really similar crew facilitating today. Myself, Dr. Joa Williams, Dr. Melissa Maris, and Dr. Alice Zhang. Next slide, please. We do not have any real disclosures to make. All of us are interested in trauma-informed and trauma-responsive care, but we do not have any financial stake in today's training. And we are attempting to share with you what is considered evidence-informed information related to intervening in the early aftermath of disaster or trauma events. Next slide, please. And just to give you a sense, so for those of you who were with us last week, we asked if you would read through the Psychological First Aid Manual, Core Actions 1 through 3. Last week, we covered core action number 1. Today, we're going to cover core actions numbers 2 and 3. And the next time we get together, which will be next Wednesday at the same time, 1 to 3 p.m., we will cover core actions 4 through 6. And we just think a way for you to get the most out of the training will be to acquaint yourself with the material beforehand. So again, there's the link, and it's typically a pretty easy read. We will also be sending you slides and chat log from today's presentation for your reference. Next slide. I also want to provide a bit of an overview about how today's going to go. Actually, we know something that's trauma-informed and trauma-aware is letting people know the plan. And after last week's session, I realized we didn't do that. So we're going to do it today. So we will start. This first hour is going to be kind of our didactic hour, but please don't let that stifle your participation. So we have people who are monitoring the chat bar for questions and thoughts that come up so that we can address them in real time if we can. And I would, offer that opportunity to you. We're interested in how you're perceiving the things that we are discussing and questions that you might have. But we're going to spend the first half of this hour covering core action number 2, safety and comfort, and you'll be largely hearing from me during that time. And then Dr. Joa Williams will talk about core action number 3, which is focused on stabilization of people who've experienced disasters. We'll have a 5-minute break. Following that, we'll come out and do about a half-hour breakout room session where we will be trying out some of the strategies and techniques that we will have discussed here in the first hour. And then we're going to end with discussion of a scenario that was given to us, presented to us, and we are going to be talking it through and thinking through if something like this happened at your place of work or a place where you volunteer, how might you use psychological first aid to help you respond and intervene? All right, next slide. So because today we're going to be largely focused on safety and comfort and stabilization, and we know that in order to provide psychological first aid, in order to promote a sense of safety and comfort, first, we ourselves have to be in a place where we are ready to provide some sort of trauma-focused intervention or response, which really means that we have to be regulated. And I just have to self-disclose a little bit that I am an avid tennis fan, and Serena Williams is battling it out right now, and I'm not feeling super regulated, but I'm going to put that aside, right? And I'll find out what happened after this training. So this will be helpful for me too. So I'm just going to talk you through a little chair yoga. Some of you might be familiar with chair yoga. It's especially proliferated in the age of constant Zoom. We really needed it. So I'll just read a little script to you. You can turn your video off for this portion if you feel more comfortable. I'd really encourage you to turn it back on for the didactic section. So this is finding your yoga seat. Your yoga seat is a home base for your practice. It's important that it's comfortable for you and that you're able to rest in this position. Notice for a moment what your body is doing right now. Is it leaning to one side? Is it tilting forward or leaning backwards? Do you feel comfortable? Now sit toward the front of your chair and place your feet flat on the floor. Feel the bottoms of your feet connecting with the floor and sit up tall. Imagine what your body would feel like if you were very proud and also a little bit relaxed. And each time you take your yoga seat, see if you can find this feeling. Now, take 2 steady breaths. All right, so now that we've had a moment to recenter and prepare for what we'll learn and discuss today, I'd invite those of you who can to turn your video on. It's great for me to see faces and get a sense for how the content is landing. But even more than that, a really big goal of this 4-part series is the connections that you might be able to make with those in your community who are also interested in doing this important work. We've said it before in these trainings, and we will continue to say it. The people who are best at responding in the early aftermath of disaster, the research shows that it's not the experts from out of town who do the most effective work when they come in and try to provide some assistance to disaster affected communities. It's the leaders and stakeholders within the disaster affected community that are able to be the most effective. So videos on if you can, and also continue introducing yourself in the chat, who you are, agency you work with, anything that you think would be important for those who are sharing this training space with you to know. All right, next slide, please. So just to get us back into the PFA frame, so psychological first aid is a modular response to disaster affected persons that happens in the very early aftermath. There are 8 core PFA actions. In any instance, you might deliver 1, you might deliver all 8. It just depends on the circumstance. And so while we walk you through the core actions in order, I think it's also helpful to just keep the broader frame of the intervention in mind at all times as well. So we're going to watch a very short video. It's only about 1.5 minutes long. In the video itself, there's some light music that plays in the background, but really the focus is just for you to watch the video. And so we're actually going to leave the sound out just because over Zoom, sometimes that doesn't translate really well. So we'll watch this short video and then come back together and dig into core action number 2. All right, thank you, Christy. So we are going to dive into the weeds a little bit today, which is great. But always remember kind of these overarching principles of making good contact, connecting people, and really attending to basic needs first. That is really what it's all about in these early moments, days, and few weeks following someone's exposure to a trauma or a crisis. So core action number 2, safety and comfort. I often tell people that once you've made contact and engaged, if all you have the opportunity to do with someone is provide a sense of safety and comfort, you have done a great deal to help support that person's own resilience and to help put them on a path toward recovery. So go on to the next slide, please. The literature really suggests that one of the biggest risk factors in terms that can predict whether or not a disaster or trauma affected person might go on to have persistent distress related to their experience is how long their biology is vulnerable, how long their stress response system remains in overdrive, how long the traumatic experience itself is. Because the longer that we are asked to recruit our fight, flight, flock, freeze mechanisms, the mechanisms that we all have that are biologically embedded within us to help us survive moments like this. These are great mechanisms and we need them when we need them. But the longer they're called upon and recruited, the more of an impact they make on us biologically and emotionally. And so one of the biggest tasks to attend to when you are working with someone who's just experienced trauma is to help them actually be physically safe as quickly as possible, but to then work toward helping them feel emotionally safe as quickly as possible. This can really matter a great deal in terms of helping someone recover and hopefully promoting resilience in the individual. Next slide. So I want to dig into this just a little bit because sometimes when I give PFA trainings, people will kind of walk away and say, all that's kind of common sense. It's kind of basic. And my response typically is, yeah, honestly, a lot of it is. But the bigger task is attending to those basics, making sure that those basics are completely addressed in a really chaotic situation, in a really potentially chaotic environment. Because the moment we encounter someone who's experiencing distress, oftentimes that creates a little bit of stress and distress within us, which sometimes makes it harder for us to focus on what needs to be done now. What is the best thing for me to do right in this moment? So many of you have, most people who signed up for this training, you all have a lot of information about the effects of trauma. Many of you are mental health providers. So I hope that lots of this is review, but I think it's very relevant here as to why safety and comfort is such an important core action. So just a little bit of the neurobiology surrounding why this is such an important core action. When we are at rest, when we are calm and regulated, I don't know, maybe take a moment to think about a time when you really feel calm and regulated. It might not be this current moment. I find these Zoom events to actually be a little bit dysregulating. There's lots of different things to attend to. Am I muted or not? I don't know how many times I think that when I'm a participant. Am I actually muted because I just picked up a phone call, from my child's daycare? Right. So try to think about a situation or time in which you truly are pretty regulated and where it's easy for you to, for example, think about the future, think about what you might like to do tomorrow. One thing I noticed when one of my children was quite young, and it was harder to have a lot of time for kind of like daily mundane tasks, right? I'm talking like the infancy period where you're like, I don't have time to make myself food anymore. Getting a shower is like a heroic effort, right? I realized that a reason that I felt a lot of stress was because I never got time to just kind of be relaxed and to think. And that a lot of that time for me occurred during, when I was out driving, or when I was making a sandwich, or when I was in the shower, those sorts of moments. So those are moments where I notice myself feeling calm and creative and reflective. And when we are calm, part of the reason that we're great about thinking about the future is because we're not worried about the current moment. We're not worried about our safety. We're not worried that our, 3:00 call today, we're in charge of it and we have to get all of the pieces in order. And so our brain kind of naturally becomes creative and thoughtful, and maybe we even have a new insight. And in these moments of calm, this kind of smarter part of our brain, our neocortex, is actually highly, highly active, the part of our brain that makes us very, very human. In this moment, right now, you're actually probably at least a little bit alert. Somebody's talking at you. Maybe I'm talking about things that you haven't heard before, or maybe it's a review, but either way, you're trying to attend to this, and maybe also your email box and your text messages, right? So you're very alert. You might not be thinking about the future, but you're focused on the present moment. And this little graphic kind of shows a cartoon of what your brain might look like, the parts of your brain that might be highly active or not when you're a little bit alert. Still have a lot of this neocortex. If I asked you all to solve a problem right now, you could probably do that. And you're probably not extremely reactive right now because your functioning is probably not very brainstem driven at this moment. I say probably because I don't know what your mornings have looked like. I don't actually know your mental state. But if I had to guess, a lot of us are kind of alert right now, able to focus on the task. Next slide, Christy. But when we are under stress, particularly extreme stress that makes us wonder if we are going to live into the next moment, stress that we might experience while a tornado is passing through our neighborhood, stress that we might experience if there's currently violence occurring in our home, whether or not it's directed toward us. The parts of our brain that become active are actually quite different. We become very responsive to the sights and sounds around us because the sights and sounds around us are our best cues and clues to whether or not we are safe and to whether or not we need to engage in any additional or new sort of action. And so, I've noticed, for example, that over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, that I have found myself, instead of being as intentional as I used to be, I've found myself reacting and responding a little bit more, like letting the emails that come through my inbox dictate my day instead of waking up with that really great plan of, hey, here's what the morning's going to look like and here's what the afternoon is going to look like. And when I did some self-reflection around that, I realized that, maybe in the morning I wake up a little bit alert and it doesn't take me much to move me to kind of an alarm state of stress, right? So what can I do to regulate myself so that I'm back in control, so that my neocortex is doing more of the work instead of these lower parts of the brain whose job is really to scan the environment for stress or for threat and to respond appropriately if or as needed. And so when you are sitting across from someone, when you are in the vicinity of someone who has just experienced a potentially life-threatening event, the parts of their brain that are more active will be the parts of their brain that are helping them survive. And they might be different parts of the brain than are really active for you in the moment. So there can often be like a mismatch of perspective between a PFA provider and a person to whom PFA is being provided that I think is very important to keep in mind, right? So when we say things like, this is kind of the basics, well, yeah, but are we really going to have a long, drawn out conversation with someone when perhaps it's safe to assume that their neocortex isn't quite as active as it typically is, given the state of extreme stress that they're currently in? That's kind of a lot of information. I'll stop there and see if we have any questions. And Christy, if you could actually skip the next slide and go on to the next one. Great. Well, seeing no questions, I'm gonna keep on moving. So again, we want to provide this sense of safety and comfort so we can decrease sometimes the strong reactive and emotional responses that someone might be having. And so that we can move the person's, really their biology, into a more regulated, adaptive state. Because the longer someone stays in a state of alarm, fear, fight, or flight, the more likely it is that their system is going to kind of habituate to that and think this is the state that keeps me alive, right? And you can see how that could lead to sleep problems that we know can compound over time. You can see how that could lead to a tendency or propensity to use drugs or alcohol to cope with the event that has occurred, or a tendency or propensity to pull away from loved ones, when in fact loved ones are people that we really need when we've experienced something significant. So focusing on safety and comfort supports better sleep, eating, decision-making, performance on life tasks, and it truly does reduce the probability of long-term mental health problems. Remember, in this early aftermath, we're not labeling any responses or reactions that trauma-exposed persons have as mental health symptoms, but we are focused on preventing mental health symptoms. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So how do we do this? Well, it will look different depending on your context, depending on who's affected, depending on what happened. But ensuring immediate physical safety is always first. So if there's been some sort of natural disaster, how do we ensure that we have people housed and located in safe locations? That's got to be the number one priority, right? The number one priority is not trying to get people to tell you their story about what happened, right? We'll always listen if people want to talk, but the initial focus is truly getting people out of harm's way. But perhaps even more important is working to ensure that people feel as if they are out of harm's way, because they are probably still receiving really strong and influential biological signals that they are not safe. So what are some practical ways that we do this? One thing is that we try to avoid additional exposure. So in our meeting earlier this morning, when we were preparing, I was talking about a time that I volunteered for the Red Cross in Lawrence, Kansas, and we were responding to an apartment fire in the area. And in the wake of the fire, it happened 10, 11 p.m. at night. So not really late, but definitely at a time that a lot of people were home and trying to sleep. And when people exited the building, it made sense for them to just kind of stand right there next to the building, watching, the fire crew come in and continue to douse the building, determine if and when the building was going to be safe for re-entry. And it struck me as a PFA trained provider that even that just exposure to the ongoing work done by first responders might not have been all that emotionally safe. So we started to do work to say, hey, are there places where we can move people such that this process is just out of sight so that it doesn't still currently feel as if the fire is occurring and going on, right? So a very small action, it didn't take us very much to move people out of the way, but our hope was that it could help promote a sense of safety and comfort and calm as quickly as possible. You also want to think about reducing media exposure. So when something stressful happens, or let's say there's been some sort of weather-related event, it's very common for news to be on in homes, in public places, in schools. And while that news can serve a purpose in terms of letting you know what to do if there's another weather alert, too much exposure, especially for someone who's just experienced a potentially life-threatening event, really seeks to keep them on alert and on edge. And the goal at this point is to bring down the distress. Now, what you might experience is that people might be a little bit resistant to you turning off the media or making these suggestions. And so you might need to do a little bit of work with people to kind of say, hey, let's just check in let's check the weather every 10 minutes, or let's make sure that the alerts are set on your phone so that if there was something important to know, you would be notified, right? Instead of having to scroll through and continually check. So it's actually very normal for a trauma exposed person to kind of feel like, no, I want to be in the know. I want to be seeing all of this. But sometimes there are some workarounds that can help make the person feel in control and safe so that they do have access to the knowledge they might need, but that can still bring down that general level of distress. Anything you can do to increase structure and communication, right? So I made sure that we had an agenda at the beginning of this training today. If you are in a situation with a trauma exposed person, how can you orient them to their current situation? The fire is over. The responders are working on it. They're going to do everything they can to salvage what they can in the building. We will give you an update every 10 minutes related to their progress. Or right now, we're working to get together some hotel vouchers so that you have a safe place to stay. And until then, we'd encourage you to sit in this area, right? Giving the information that a person needs so that they can begin to orient themselves to time and place and future. A future orientation is an important thing to instill because it helps kind of pull someone out of that past event that was really frightening and threatening, kind of toward a reorientation to a world that is safe. We always want to be honest with people. So if there might be another set of tornadoes in 2 hours, we wouldn't want to lie about that and say, oh, the severe weather's over. But we also wouldn't want to present that information in a threatening way. And we would always want to present it alongside a plan, right? So there is a hint that we could have another storm cell come through that won't be for 2 hours. And this is our plan to keep everyone safe, both right now and when that occurs. Also very important to solicit and answer any pressing questions and meet basic needs. Sometimes the best safety and comfort you can provide is water, is a cell phone for someone to use to call a loved one, a pillow, a blanket. Lots of people, when they are in that fight or flight response, they might actually shake or shiver a little bit because of the adrenaline, and something like a blanket can be really, really meaningful in a moment like that, and can also make a person feel really seen, right? This provider knew that I might have this type of physiological response, and they knew what to offer. I really must be in a safe situation. I really must be getting to the point where things are going to start looking up and looking better. Next slide, Christy. Kind the last thing that I want to point out here about safety and comfort, and we will talk about this again when we get to the core action about connection with social support. But the presence of other caring individuals, especially individuals to which the survivor has been previously connected and had positive experiences with, can really be, for some, the single best source of safety and comfort following trauma exposure. This doesn't mean immediately smothering them with hugs or talking their ear off, but really in these early moments, mere presence can mean a lot. Mere access, letting someone know, I've got a cell phone you could use anytime to call somebody that you need to call, because I know you couldn't find your cell phone before leaving when you found out that the apartment was on fire, right? Those little bits of information that let people know that I'm connected and I'm not alone can really do a lot to soothe the biological response that has just occurred in someone who faced a trauma. All right, next slide. All right, so that's core action 2 in a very short description, just a very short description of it. And we will chew on some of these issues a little bit more during the breakout room. But at this point, I want to go ahead and turn the mic over to Dr. Joa Williams, who's going to talk through core action number 3, stabilization.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you so much for that great overview of safety and comfort. I mean, I think that, just to reiterate some of the points that Dr. Hambrick made there, it's absolutely critical, and it says a lot to the folks that we're working with when we really make an effort to make sure that people know that we want them to be comfortable and that we want to create conditions where they really can be as safe as we can possibly make a situation, especially in the immediate aftermath of a trauma. And so I kind of think in some ways of stabilization as a module that really sort of fits in with the broad idea of safety and comfort, right? Because sometimes we're going to work with folks. We may come in, we may establish contact, try to engage patients or engage trauma affected individuals, youth families. We sort of immediately kind of introduce ourselves, try to ensure that the conditions are safe for continued engagement so that we can sort of continue with the PFA contact. But it may be the case that depending on the recency of the trauma or the disaster, that sometimes folks are going to be really upset, right? And so much so that they may not be able to actively sort of participate in the intervention, right? Or may not necessarily be responsive to, first responders, others who are there on scene, kind of trying to assess the situation and provide support, right? So one of the things that we sometimes have to think about doing is promoting stabilization. So this is kind of the third module that we're going to talk about with PFA. And so we'll talk a little bit about that and how that fits in with some of the other pieces that we've talked about so far. And so again, I appreciate everyone being back this week. For those of you who were here last week, thank you again for coming back, and glad that you're here to continue this discussion with us. But let's think a bit about stabilization and how this kind of fits in with all the different components that we've talked about so far, what the goal is, and when you might use this particular module. So again, stabilization, like many of the modules we'll talk about in PFA, are sort of optional. Sometimes we have to pick and decide which modules are going to be most appropriate for folks. Contact and engagement and safety and comfort, I think, are really sort of core things we want to do with all survivors. But this is one that tends to be a little bit more optional, in the sense that I think you'll see that this is going to be more appropriate for some people than others. So let's take a look at this, see what's involved, and think about when we would use this particular module. And again, folks, please jump in and do ask questions as I go through, and I'll try to keep an eye out on the chat box as well if questions come through. And if I miss one, please don't hesitate to point it out to me. But when we think about stabilization, sort of the third module in psychological first aid, or PFA, the goal of this module really is to try to calm and orient emotionally overwhelmed or disoriented survivors. So Dr. Hambrick sort of mentioned that we really want to try to help, reduce distress for folks when we're ensuring conditions of safety and comfort. But sometimes distress can be so intense and so overwhelming that we have to take additional steps, right? Or we have to sort of think about unique considerations for how to help alleviate distress for the folks who are experiencing really, really intense arousal. So we're going to sort of talk about that and things that you can look for to sort of identify that. So again, the goal here is to calm and orient emotionally overwhelmed or disoriented survivors. And you'll recall that when we talked about risk factors for chronic trauma-related mental health problems during last week's session, one of the most well-known, most robust risk factors that we know has been sort of identified in the clinical literature on trauma-related mental health problems is the intensity of the emotional reaction in response to the trauma. So those peri-traumatic reactions, right? How intense is the reaction that I have in the immediate aftermath of a trauma or during a traumatic event? So for some folks, this is going to be appropriate to just, again, sort of help sort of alleviate some of that immediate distress. But note that most survivors that we work with are not going to require this module. So we're going to spend some time talking about it because I think that it's really important for us to know how to use, right? But most people aren't going to necessarily need this. So we'll talk about what it looks like and who it's for. And I did use the term peri-traumatic. So when someone on chat just asked sort of, what did I mean by that? And when I say peri-traumatic, that's a term that is often used in sort of the research literature on traumatic stress to describe how a person responds kind of at the time a trauma is happening or sort of in its immediate aftermath, right? So in the first like few hours or so after something happens. But what was the experience that you had emotionally, sort of what were you thinking, right, at the time a trauma was happened? And that's just what we mean when we say peri-traumatic. So great question. Thank you so much for asking that. Great question. So let's move on. So we'll think a little bit about this then. So who is this for, right? And sort of what's the goal here? So let's continue on to the next slide. So I think an important thing to remember, note that I said that stabilization is a module that really isn't going to be needed for most survivors. Most survivors will be able to respond to our efforts to establish safety and comfort, and will respond to that really well, right? But some folks will need a little bit more intensive kind of intervention. But one thing that I think is absolutely important for us to remember, right, and thinking about this is that expressing strong emotions, right, or for that matter, kind of the opposite, even suppressing emotion, right, or seeming kind of detached and withdrawn is a really normal response to trauma, okay? So when we're working with survivors, expect that a lot of folks are probably going to have pretty intense reactions, right, especially in the aftermath of trauma. And so intense, strong emotion, right, isn't necessarily an indicator that we need to think about efforts to stabilize the person that we're working with, okay? So just remember when working with folks, expect some really strong emotions or expect really strong, intense emotions to come up. And a lot of times that's not going to require intervention on our part beyond supportive contact. So being a supportive presence, someone who can advocate for the person that you're there with, advocate for that child, advocate for that family. That in and of itself is often going to be sufficient to sort of help stabilize strong emotion for folks. So we're going to talk about things that you can look for to clue you in as to whether the strong emotion may be at a level that warrants stabilization. But one thing that I wanted to sort of briefly talk about with you before we get to that point is to just think about, again, the wide range of strong reactions that are well within sort of the normal realm of what we would expect and how people respond to psychological trauma, right? Because I think we can avoid unnecessary attempts at stabilizing survivors when we're just familiar with the range of normal reactions that people often have in the aftermath of traumatic events. So recall that when we met for our first session of the Echo last week, we talked about some common acute kinds of reactions that people have to traumatic stress. And I know, and folks, feel free to jump in and kind of chime in on this in chat, but what are some of the common sort of emotional reactions that we discussed last time that we can certainly expect to see when we think about just the range of intense, strong emotion that people are likely going to be having from the time the trauma happened up until the point we intervene with something like psychological first aid. So the first like 24, 48 hours, what are folks probably really, what's happening emotionally for us? Disbelief, agitation, yes, yeah, absolutely, right? So disbelief, agitation, anger, right? Intense fear, right? The helplessness that can sometimes come with trauma exposure, flashbacks. Yeah, so these, these emotional experiences are often happening in tandem with sort of those intrusive memories of what we just saw and lived through, shock. So yeah, absolutely. Folks are kind of pointing out a lot of things, right, that people might see. And grief. So someone mentioned grief here, and I'm glad that you did. Because I think that it's also important to be familiar with the range of grief responses that folks might experience as well, because grief certainly can occur in response to traumatic events, especially when a trauma leads to the sudden or unexpected death of a loved one. But it's important to sort of think about those kinds of reactions in their own right, because while similar to reactions that we might have to trauma more broadly, grief reactions actually can look a little bit different. So I think we also just have to be mindful of the range of normal grief reactions that folks are going to feel, in addition to that sort of intense arousal, fear, anger, sort of some of the things that we talked about that you might see in response to trauma, right? Or other kinds of traumatic events. So if we go to the next slide, let's just take a look at that and think a bit about some common grief responses that we might see. And similar to what we talked about when we talked about how people sort of naturally and normally respond to a wide range of traumatic events, common reactions that you're likely to see in working with folks, especially if a trauma or disaster resulted in the death of someone close to that person, is that you're likely going to see a lot of shock and disbelief. And folks on chat sort of jumped in and mentioned several of those things, right? So unlike working with trauma survivors, maybe where it's not known whether a person was killed, or at least no one close to the person that they know of was killed as a result of the trauma, where you might see a lot of sort of just intense fear or physical kind of arousal where the person's kind of scanning and looking for danger, right? And seems kind of more physiologically aroused and agitated. Sometimes with grief, you won't necessarily see that. The presentation can look a lot more like just the person feels completely in shock and doesn't seem to fully grasp or understand what's happening, right? And I think, all of us at different points in our lives can probably draw on our own experiences of knowing and learning about the death of a loved one and can understand that intuitively on some level, right? Certainly, I think that can be intensified and exacerbated in cases where we're talking about sudden and unexpected death, which is often typical when we're talking about traumatic events. But certainly shock and disbelief are going to be well within sort of the normal range of how folks are going to respond to traumatic experiences that result in unexpected death. The same kinds of distress that we talked about with trauma may also be present in cases of sudden and unexpected death as well. So sometimes we'll see a lot of intense acute distress. Anger is often fairly common. One thing that we might also see, especially in cases of grief or unexpected grief, is guilt, right? Sometimes we may find that folks are experiencing, even in that acute aftermath, a lot of intense guilt about having not been able to do something to have prevented the death from happening, right? So we may feel that if only we had done this morning, right? If only if only we had gone somewhere else this morning instead of where we went, we might not have been there at the time that the event happened, right? So we start to kind of mentally think about all the things that we had done up to that point that potentially could have led to different outcomes. And so guilt is something that many survivors start to experience. And again, well within sort of a normal range of what folks are likely to experience. But cognitively, what starts to happen, right? That physiological arousal that we see with trauma that can also occur in the context of grief starts to lead to disruptions in concentration, sleep disturbances. You're going to have trouble sort of encoding all the things that are happening to you because you're so distracted by just the emotional pain of everything that's happening and just sort of the chaos that often occurs in the context of the immediate aftermath of a trauma. So memory impairment's pretty common. So again, these are all just a different sort of type of experience that are unique from sort of the primary physiological and psychological responses that we see to trauma more broadly, but certainly grief experiences are closely related, but can look a little bit different. So I just wanted to sort of briefly go over some of these different types of reactions here, so folks are just familiar with the range of sort of normal things that we're likely going to see. And again, folks experiencing shock and disbelief, anger, folks who are having difficulty concentrating, right? we might do better to focus on providing safety and comfort for those folks more so than stabilization. Because if folks are experiencing things that we would absolutely expect anybody in that situation to be experiencing, we don't necessarily need to step it up to a higher level of intervention, right? As much as maybe just give those folks the space to experience the normal reactions that we all experience as people having gone through these kinds of important events and losses. So these are all just, again, things to be looking for, things to be mindful of when you're doing your own work in this realm. And I think, things that we can just kind of keep in the back of our minds, but know that there's really no right or wrong way to grieve. I actually, in my work as a researcher and a clinician, do a lot of work with acutely bereaved families. And so one of the things that we often talk about with folks is there's no right or wrong way to go through this. Whatever you experience is fair game, right? There's really no right way to grieve and there's no wrong way to grieve. And often when talking to families, I think families appreciate information where we sometimes just acknowledge that even within families, we may all grieve in slightly different ways. So just because one of you may seem to be responding this way doesn't necessarily mean that they're not grieving privately in their own way, right? And that's okay. Or because somebody else seems to be grieving more outwardly in a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with that either. So again, I think just recognizing the wide range of responses that we can see is often helpful for us and helpful for the folks that we're working with. But that being said, what are some things that we can look for to help us decide whether or not more intensive efforts to stabilize patients are really needed and really indicated, right? So if folks don't necessarily seem to be responding to our attempts to just ensure their immediate safety or efforts to sort of provide comfort, are still kind of, the person is still feeling really upset and having difficulty engaging, like what are some things that we can look for to decide whether stabilization is really indicated? So let's go to the next slide and we'll think a bit about some things that we can look for, right? So again, knowing that there's a wide range of strong emotions that people have in response to trauma, there are a few signs that you can sort of look for as providers to help decide whether or not someone needs stabilization. And I appreciate the question that just popped up on chat here, how do cultural responses affect this? And I want to just briefly touch on that too as we sort of get to the bottom of the slide here. But thinking about some signs that you might look for, right, to help you decide whether someone needs stabilization. Is the person extremely agitated, right? So when we say sort of extremely agitated, right, what kind of things might come to mind? What do we mean by extremely agitated? Right, so if we're starting to think about, right, verbal or physical aggression, yelling, physical violence, right? Yeah, absolutely, right? Anger is a normal response. If we start to see that a person's becoming verbally or physically aggressive towards others, right, that can be an indication that maybe stabilization is needed, right? Or just not making sense, yeah, so that sort of cognitively, if a person's having difficulty sort of staying on track and engaging in the conversation, then that can be a good indication that maybe stabilization is reaching heights where we might want to do something more intensive. By that, the same thing that was just said, someone else mentioned on chat there, shutting down, right? One of the things that we see when Dr. Hambrick was talking about fight or flight responses, the sympathetic nervous system kind of kicks into gear and we see a lot of heightened arousal, right? But one other thing that can happen in trauma, that freeze response, is that we see overactivation of the parasympathetic system. So we shut down, right? And there's just, those are two different types of reactions, but both well within how people may respond due to a variety of factors. So agitation can start to look different for different folks, but all great points that folks made there. But uncontrollable physical reactions are also a good indicator that maybe more intensive stabilization efforts are needed as well, right? So trembling, shaking, if you see that a person's having sort of really intense sort of panic type reactions that are interfering in their ability to be able to engage, right? That can also be kind of a good indicator. If the person seems to be losing touch with their surroundings, and that's one of the things that we see with that shutting down kind of freeze response that Dr. Hambrick was talking about a little while ago in safety and comfort, right? If folks are sort of experiencing that freeze kind of reaction, that where you just, you think deer in the headlights kind of look, and we often, see that that's a very common way of responding to trauma. That's kind of the body shutting down, right? We're seeing overactivation of parasympathetic responses there. And so the experience that person has subjectively to that is that you may not even sort of know where you are, who you're talking to. You may lose just some important information that orients you to where you are, date, time, what's happening. So if the person seems to be losing touch with what's happening, that can be a good indicator that maybe stabilization is needed. Ongoing intense crying sometimes can be an indicator that a person might need stabilization, but it may not always mean that, right? So I'm mentioning some of these things here as just signs to look for, but in and of themselves, extreme agitation, ongoing intense crying, right? All of those things are things that we might look for, but we absolutely have to remember that how we express emotion is influenced by a whole range of factors, especially family and cultural factors, right? So we have to really consider, I think, when we're working with folks, are the emotions that we're seeing, no matter how strong, appropriate, and do they make sense in light of the cultural background and the family background, right, of the person that I'm working with right now? Because if they make sense, and this is really sort of how, based on this person's family environment and this person's cultural background, we would expect folks to sort of process something really difficult and intense that they've just gone through, right? Efforts to stabilize that aren't necessarily indicated or appropriate for where that person is. So I think we have to really be thoughtful about that. And it's absolutely important for us, especially as sort of PFA providers, right? And as a community of folks that are thinking about how to empower ourselves to work more closely together, we really need to think about having good connections and good working connections with community leaders, all across the area, and all across the areas and the communities that we work in, who are familiar with sort of local norms and customs and are familiar with the kinds of reactions that would be expected, right, within the local communities that we are serving and that we're engaging in. So there we have to really, I think, in addition to thinking about how we do interventions like psychological first aid, never forget the importance of challenging ourselves to be culturally competent providers and professionals, right? And making sure that we sort of educate ourselves and are familiar with the various sort of cultural norms of the different folks that we work in and the diverse groups that live and work alongside us in the communities where we all live and work, right?
I just wanted to jump just to piggyback on that great point. And, just as important as it is to pay attention to who we are working with is to pay attention to who we are and how someone's response or interest in receiving intervention from us might have to do with us, the kind of the cultural history that we are bringing to the situation as well.
That's right. Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, absolutely. So, someone asked about the influence of culture earlier in chat, and does that sort of make sense? I wanted to come back to just ask, but does that sort of make sense to folks, or what questions do folks kind of have about this at this point? So again, I think just, look for some of these signs, but also just understand whether or not some of these sort of markers or indicators that we just talked about here really make sense in light of the person, who they are, and their background, right? So I think if we can sort of understand that, then another key thing for us to look for is the emotion so intense or so overwhelming, right? Whether we're talking about being too aroused or too shut down, whichever the case may be, is the emotion so overwhelming that the person is now starting to have difficulty engaging with other providers. Parents are now starting to have difficulty providing care for their kids, right? And so now I'm not sure how to take care of my child because I'm so emotionally overwhelmed, right? Or I'm noticing that, I really don't know how to sort of plan for what the next steps are, and it's interfering with problem solving. So I think that those are some things that we start to look for. If the emotion is so intense that it starts to disrupt functioning and things that a person might really need to do to fulfill important roles at that moment for their family and their community, then we have to sort of think about additional steps to help stabilize emotion. So next slide. So let's hop to that. So thinking about that, how do you stabilize, right? What do you do? And what are the steps involved in stabilization? With this module, this is really something that I want to sort of reiterate and emphasize here. I think this is where, to help stabilize folks, we really can think about, minimum intervention is often likely going to be the best intervention, right? And we just slowly step it up and can provide more intensive support and intervention as needed, right? But I think we start with less, work up to more as needed. So there are actually a few things that we can do that are likely going to help stabilize the vast majority of folks who need this particular module, right? So if you're thinking about working with really over-aroused or under-aroused trauma-affected youth or families, here are some things that often are going to be enough for most people, okay? And notice this isn't particularly intensive from an intervention standpoint, right? And kind of complements how we would think about establishing contact and engagement and how we would create safety for folks. The first thing that we always do, respect a person's privacy and just give them a few minutes, right? Remember that folks are going to experience strong emotion and that's normal. So sometimes if we just give folks a little bit of space, if we introduce ourselves, but it's clear that they're really upset and they might need a little bit of time, give folks that time and respect that folks have the right to naturally process traumatic events like this with strong emotion, right? Because that's part of what makes us as human beings who we are. And so respecting that folks have the right to be able to be a person, right? And to respond that way for a little while. I think just honestly, without saying that you need intervention for that can go a long way for folks. So just respect privacy and give folks a few minutes before intervening. But I think remaining calm, quiet, but present, right, is also an important piece to this. Just being available, but respecting a person's space and not necessarily feeling like you have to say something or have to do something, but just sharing in that space with the person in the moment can often be enough to help stabilize really distressed or upset patients. So for example, if you're working with someone who is experiencing intense, strong affect and intense, strong emotion, for example, whether we're talking about trauma or traumatic grief, sometimes just physically sitting nearby, but not necessarily violating the person's personal space, right? You don't want to get too close. And we've talked a lot about that in the contact and engagement piece last time, but just thinking about how can I be nearby? And if there are other things that maybe you need to be doing, in a disaster, post-disaster sort of setting or context, whether it's, making a couple of, if you have to fill out a couple of forms or do something else or whatever the case may be, right? You can do those things nearby enough that a person sees that you're there, right? Knows that you're available for comfort, but you don't necessarily have to say or do anything. Sometimes just presence is enough. But you can give folks information. So Dr. Hambrick talked a bit about just, providing information to folks. And again, I think information about what's happening, what's likely going to happen, here's what we know about the circumstances of things, right? Often can be really stabilizing and help folks sort of just naturally begin the process of emotional stabilization and recovery. But if you're working with youth and children, though, one thing that I think is also important just to remind folks of, if parents and caregivers are nearby, so if you know that parents or caregivers are nearby, but maybe they weren't there when you tried to help stabilize an upset child, for example, if you can find parents and caregivers, we generally would encourage you focus on empowering them in their role of calming the child, right? So if you can find the parent or the caregiver, sort of work with the parent to talk about tips for things that they can do to help calm the child, right? Give them information about normal reactions, but also talk with them about how they can be there to best comfort and support the child. So I think, again, when parents or caregivers are available, really, we're kind of working to help teach them and support them how to help respond to the child. But if not, then certainly we can sort of do this and we can help do some of these roles. And we're going to talk about some more intensive steps that you can take if just presence and information in and of itself, right, isn't necessarily sufficient to help stabilize folks. So let's go on to the next slide then, and we'll think about sort of some other strategies that you can take if more than our presence is sometimes needed. So one exercise that is often, I think, received really well by a wide range of folks, that can often be especially helpful as sort of a stabilizing intervention or technique, is something called grounding. And I'm curious how many folks out there are familiar with grounding as a strategy or an exercise. I know some of the folks on top of my screen that I can see, I saw some raised hands. So yeah, so I know some folks are familiar. But I'm often, I noticed that a lot of people have sort of encountered grounding techniques in different trainings that you've done along the way. So let's talk about this. What is grounding, and why is it important? And yeah, so Melissa and I saw that you popped something up on the screen there at the bottom or on chat that was saying sort of focusing in on something, right? And that's absolutely it. That's basically the idea. With grounding, the whole sort of idea of what we want to try to do here is really just to help sort of reorient people away from the intense internal experiences that they're likely having, to shift their attention to sort of the basic conditions of safety in the immediate surroundings, right? As much as we can provide those, to just help remind people that they're in a safe space now, and try to, again, help reduce some of that distress. So if we go to the next slide, let me kind of give you an idea of what I mean by that, by sort of turning your attention outward, right, to things in the immediate environment that convey a sense of safety or comfort. With grounding, really what we want to try to encourage folks to do is just use your senses, right? We don't often have a lot of, other things available to us in post-disaster settings, but if we can just use our senses, that's one thing that's probably in overdrive anyway. We can use those senses to help sort of orient us to stabilizing cues in the environment. So if the person's willing to sit down, or if you have a place where the person can sit down, often I'll kind of encourage folks to sit down, somewhere where they're comfortable. Focus on just breathing normally, but try to slow your breathing down a bit. But then as folks look around and just name 5 things that you can see around you that are comforting or not distressing, right? So at a post-disaster kind of setting, that can honestly be anything, right? From that you might see, whether we're talking about just, I'm noticing the corner over here in the wall where the corners intersect, right? And I'm noticing the tiles on the floor right now. I can kind of see that. Use whatever is visual and is in front of you, and have the person describe it out loud to you, right? Because again, that's going to take effort, especially for somebody who's really upset and really distressed. But that effort to focus on sort of benign, non-distressing sort of cues in the environment can sometimes be enough to just dampen that arousal enough that a person is more open, receptive, and engaged in what's going to then unfold for the rest of the contact, okay? So then you kind of ask the person, so you've described what you can see to me. Let's use our hearing. Use your hearing senses. What do you hear right now that's non-distressing and not upsetting for you, right? That can be anything from just, I noticed the sound of the air conditioner running right now, right? Or I noticed the sound of someone walking down the hall, or I noticed just the hum of the ceiling fan, whatever it might be, right? So have the person just listen, describe what they can hear, things that are non-distressing. Kind of remind the person to keep breathing as, just normally and slowly as possible. Then name things that you can feel. Well, I feel the wooden handle on the chair that I'm sitting in right now. Or, if we're in a hospital, for example, sometimes we do this with folks in hospitals. I notice the feel of the mattress beneath me, right? I can tell what that feels like right now. Or I just notice I notice what the blanket feels like in my fingers, and that's something I can kind of describe. So use your senses, use all available senses, and just ask folks to kind of describe in detail what they're picking up around them, but focusing specifically on things that indicate to them that they're at least now in a safe place where they're not in immediate danger in that moment, right? Unless you are in immediate danger, but we wouldn't want to do PFA in that case, right? Those would be we'd respond differently to that, right? But if we have folks in a comfortable place where we can engage them in this kind of work, have them just orient themselves to sort of safe cues. But does that make sense? This is kind of the goal, kind of the idea overall of what we do with grounding. Does this make sense? Or what questions do folks have about that? Well, we're actually going to practice some of this here in a little while in our breakout rooms. So you'll get a feel for kind of how to walk somebody through this, and even kind of practice it a little bit as well. So you can just get a good feel for it, for what it would be like if someone were doing this kind of intervention with you, right? And I think it's important for us to know that as well. as folks that are going out and providing these kind of services to others. But one other thing that I'll just sort of mention here before we get ready to take a break is if we go to the next slide, in addition to grounding exercises, I think sometimes it can also just be important, especially when we're working with kids and youth and adults too, for that matter. But, you know, sometimes it's also important to note that sometimes we can just help folks sort of stabilize by helping them engage in distracting kind of activities that are calming and relaxing to them too. So if our efforts to help reduce arousal through grounding or focusing on breathing, you know, aren't necessarily having the effect that we want, or the person just didn't seem open or receptive to that, I think, you know, there are a lot of other things we can do. So for example, if a child's just, you know, really, you know, aroused or not wanting to talk to an adult right now about what's happened, that's okay. We can find a safe place, private place, and maybe coloring would feel better for you right now, you know what, or just listening to some calm music or reading, right? You know, distraction in the aftermath of trauma is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Sometimes it can actually help put us in a place where we can then begin to process in a much healthier way, or in a way, in sort of a natural way, right? So I think that when we think about that, you know, there are a wide range of things that we can do to sort of help promote stabilization. And if somebody just doesn't want to talk about their experiences and doesn't want to engage in other kinds of, you know, intensive intervention using, you know, this or other kinds of approaches, just kind of help folks find distracting things that they can do to help, you know, to help make them more calm and comfortable in that moment. And there's a whole wide range of things we can do there. So get creative. I think in trauma work, we have to often be creative, right? And so draw on what works for the person, and never be afraid to think outside the box a bit, because certainly trauma doesn't fit in boxes, and neither can our responses. But I think with that, we'll sort of pause here. And if folks have questions or anything else, feel free to throw those out on the chat. And I think, are we up for a break now, or do we have
we are. So we'll return in 5 minutes, and we'll have a little timer up to indicate the 5 minutes. All right, everyone, I'd like to go ahead and welcome you back. It was a quick break, but we're going to go straight into another chair yoga. So we'll move ourselves back into this gently as we start to move toward our breakout rooms. So go ahead and turn your video on if you'd like, or you can leave it off for this. But we're going to do an energy level check-in. My energy struggles in the afternoon, so I planned this one to meet my own needs. I guess you get to do that if you're presenting. But I'd encourage you to sit in a tall and relaxed position, taking a few breaths and noticing how your body feels. And now think of a number from 1 through 5, with 1 being the lowest energy level. You're almost asleep. 5 being the highest, you can barely sit still. And decide what your energy level is right now. And when you've thought of a number, place 1 hand on your chest and 1 on your belly, and take a few more breaths. Scan your body simply to determine how your body feels at the energy level, and say inside your own mind, this is what my body feels like at this energy level. Take a breath and say, this is how my feet and legs feel at this energy level. This is how my face and head feel at this energy level. This is how my mind feels at this energy level. And take 1 more full breath and say, this is what my body feels like at this energy level. I would encourage those of you who are interested in disaster response work to make a daily practice of checking in with how you feel at different energy levels, or how your body feels in different situations and scenarios. because in the midst of an potentially intense response, you having good knowledge of where you are and signals related to when you start to move up that arousal continuum will be really important in terms of letting you know the type of work that you're prepared for at a given moment. So I'll encourage each of you to turn your videos back on. And Chris, if you can move to the next slide, I think we're going to move straight into our breakout rooms, and we're going to be there for about 25 minutes, and then we'll come back and briefly discuss a scenario. It's going to take us a minute to make sure that everybody gets to the right room, but we had a little dress rehearsal this morning, and I think the facilitators all know how to get to their appointed rooms, but there'll be 4 different rooms and 4 different facilitators. So we will go ahead and get that process initiated. You should receive an invitation to let you know which room to join, and please accept that invitation when you receive it.
Right, so everyone should be joining us back now.
Awesome. Works well, Christy. Good job.
This time I wish we were having more time.
Yeah, I know. We got interrupted, but
Yeah, I popped into all of them and everybody was having good discussions, so that's great.
Yeah. Oh, totally. So I said I'd take a couple of minutes here. Let's see. We are back to 59, getting there. Everybody's giving shout outs to their room. Yeah, room 1.
That's good to hear.
As people are coming back, in my room, there was a question about, these moments can feel awkward. They can feel forced. Sometimes they can even feel kind of rushed. And so we were talking about, if you approach someone and, they're really kind of hyperventilating, maybe it's even hard to get a response from them that they are interested in you speaking to them, being near them, that sort of thing. Like Joa, Dr. Williams said, sometimes we have to be really creative, and sometimes the person even feeling a bit of a positive relational interaction with you can help. And so sometimes what you might do is make contact and engage and move away for a couple minutes, but keep your eye on the person and then come back and do that 2 or 3 times before you offer some sort of calming, grounding exercise. Other times you might choose to model it and to say, I'm not going to force you to do anything that you're not interested in doing. I want to show something that helps me, and kind of doing that modeling and allowing the person to decide if they want to join in or not. Because sometimes there is a lot of nonverbal, but letting people know nothing's going to be forced, but I'll show this can be a way to help. Yes, our room got cut off with conversation, and it sounds like others did too, but I'll take that as a good sign overall. We were talking and interested. Room leaders, anything else that would be important for me to wrap up about this exercise before we move on?
I think the one thing that I would add, Erin,
Yeah.
in our breakout room, room 2, we talked about kind of this idea of having sort of a toolbox and like a general set of tips and tricks that then you use and you augment based on kind of developmentally where someone is and also kind of how they're responding. And kind of with the idea that it's easier to remember sort of these 3 or 4 things that are your go-tos, but that you adjust depending on the context and the age and the situation, versus having to think about all of these as distinct buckets of tips and tricks that really these apply across the lifespan, but they might just need to be adjusted a little bit to be appropriate. But otherwise, we had a great conversation. I appreciate everybody's input.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Always going with something that feels routine for you that you can do in a moment of potential stress. Comes to mind that describes something new you learned or would like to use in the future based on today's session. I like to see that the grounding stood out. It's useful. And it's right at 3, and I know you all are busy, so thank you very much for your attendance today. And we look forward to seeing you next week for to start the second half of our psychological first aid training.
And we'll send out the final word cloud with the other materials, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.